Lake houses are supposed to be peaceful getaways, places where families create memories and escape the chaos of everyday life. But what happens when that dream vacation becomes your worst nightmare? What happens when the water you're swimming in hides something that's been watching you the entire time? Tonight, I'm bringing you 7 of the most disturbing true lake house horror stories ever documented. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll never look at lakefront property the same way again. In Minnesota, a family reunion turned into a police investigation when they discovered someone had been watching them from beneath the water for days. In Lake Tahoe, a couple's luxury Airbnb rental revealed a hidden basement that explained why 13 previous guests had checked out in the middle of the night without explanation. A winter caretaker in the Canadian wilderness started hearing knocking on his walls at exactly 3 a.m. every single night. And when he finally investigated, what he found under the frozen lake made national headlines. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what multiple witnesses have reported seeing in the depths of Lake Hartwell, something so massive and unexplainable that experienced scuba divers refuse to go below 60 feet anymore. These aren't campfire tales or urban legends. These are real events, documented incidents, and first-hand accounts from people who lived through absolute terror. Before we dive in, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you never miss our daily horror content. Because trust me, you're going to want to hear every single one of these stories. Story number 7 will genuinely make you question everything you thought you knew about what lives in deep water. Let's begin. Story 1. The Watcher Below. In late October of 2019, the Brennan family arrived at their rented lake house on the shores of Lake Vermont in northern Minnesota for what was supposed to be a peaceful family reunion. Marcus and Diane Brennan had booked the property for an entire week, bringing along their 3 children and Diane's elderly parents. The house itself was everything they'd hoped for. A beautiful 2-story cabin with a wraparound deck that overlooked crystal-clear water so transparent you could see straight down to the rocky bottom 30 feet below. Lake Vermilion is known for its exceptional clarity, but it's also one of the deepest lakes in Minnesota, with certain areas plunging over 300 feet into absolute darkness. The property was isolated, which the family loved. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away by boat, and cell phone service was practically non-existent. It felt like they'd stepped into another world, far away from the stress of their everyday lives. On their second day there, the family spent the afternoon swimming off the dock. The water was freezing, typical for late October in Minnesota. But the kids didn't seem to mind. Marcus was floating on his back, enjoying the silence, when his youngest daughter, 8-year-old Chloe, suddenly screamed and scrambled out of the water so fast she scraped her knees on the wooden ladder. She was hysterical, crying and pointing down into the depths beneath the dock. When Marcus finally calmed her down enough to speak, she said something that made his blood run cold. "There's someone down there, Daddy. Someone was watching us from the bottom. I saw their face looking up at me." Marcus dove under to check, opening his eyes in the stinging cold water, but saw nothing except rocks and a few fish. He assured Chloe it was probably just a large fish or maybe a shadow from the clouds passing overhead. She insisted she knew what she saw, that it was a person's face, pale and bloated, staring directly at her. But children have active imaginations, especially in unfamiliar places, so the family brushed it off as a trick of the light. That night, Diane couldn't sleep. She stood on the deck around 2 in the morning, wrapped in a blanket and staring out at the lake. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the perfectly still water. That's when she saw it. A dark shape moving just beneath the surface, circling slowly about 50 feet from shore. It was too large to be a fish, too deliberate in its movements. She watched it for nearly 10 minutes, her heart pounding, before it finally descended back into the depths and disappeared. She didn't tell anyone the next morning, afraid they'd think she was being paranoid like Chloe. The following day, Marcus decided to take the family's rental boat out for some fishing. He'd anchored in a deep section of the lake, where his depth finder showed the bottom was over 200 feet down. He'd been fishing for maybe 20 minutes when he noticed something strange. The anchor rope, which should have been angled down toward the lake bed, was completely vertical, as if something had pulled the anchor directly beneath the boat. Then the rope started moving, not drifting with current, but being pulled slowly and deliberately in a wide circle around the boat. Marcus grabbed the rope and felt resistance on the other end, like someone was tugging back. He pulled harder, and suddenly the rope went slack. When he finally hauled up the anchor, the metal was covered in deep scratches, fresh gouges that definitely hadn't been there before. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely steer the boat back to shore. That evening, Diane's father, Robert, mentioned something at dinner that made everyone go quiet. He'd been sitting on the dock that afternoon, reading a book, when he felt like someone was watching him. When he looked down into the water, he saw what he described as a pale oval shape hovering about 20 feet below the surface, perfectly motionless, positioned directly beneath where he was sitting. The moment he stood up to get a better look, it shot downward and vanished into the darkness below. He admitted he'd been too embarrassed to mention it earlier, but after hearing about Chloe's experience and the strange boat incident, he felt he needed to say something. The family was now genuinely unsettled. 3 separate people had experienced something bizarre in that water. Marcus decided to do some research on the property. What he found made the situation exponentially worse. 5 years earlier, the previous owners of the lake house had reported similar incidents to local police, claiming someone was watching them from the water, that objects kept disappearing from their dock, and that their boats would drift away despite being securely tied. The police had investigated but found nothing suspicious. The owners eventually sold the property at a significant loss, telling the realtor they couldn't stand living there anymore. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Marcus kept digging through local news archives and found something from 2003. A man named David Keller had been arrested for trespassing on various properties around Lake Vermilion. According to the police report, Keller was an experienced free diver who'd become obsessed with watching people from underwater. He would hold his breath for extraordinary lengths of time, sometimes over 6 minutes, and position himself beneath docks and swimming areas to observe families without their knowledge. He'd been caught when a homeowner's underwater camera captured footage of him. But the dates didn't add up. Keller had been arrested in 2003, and these recent incidents were happening in 2019. On their final night at the lake house, Marcus couldn't let it go. He bought an underwater camera from a sporting goods store in town, the kind that ice fishermen use, and lowered it off the dock after dark. The family gathered around the small screen as the camera descended into the black water. At 50 feet, they could see nothing but darkness and the occasional fish passing through the beam of the camera's light. Marcus kept lowering it, watching the depth counter climb 60 feet, 70, 80. At 93 feet, something appeared on the screen that made Diane actually scream. It was a camera, a professional-grade underwater camera system mounted on a metal frame, aimed directly upward at the surface. But it wasn't just one camera. As Marcus panned his camera around, they could see multiple devices, all positioned at different angles, all pointing up toward where the family had been swimming for the past week. Someone had built an entire underwater surveillance station 90 feet below their dock. Marcus immediately called the police. When the sheriff's department sent divers down the next morning, they recovered 4 cameras, 2 underwater lights, and what appeared to be a weighted chair positioned in the center of the array. The equipment was sophisticated and expensive, clearly placed by someone who knew what they were doing. But here's the part that still haunts the Brennan family. When police examined the footage from the cameras, the memory cards showed recordings going back over 2 years, hundreds of hours of families swimming, children playing, people who had no idea they were being watched by someone sitting in the darkness below. The timestamps showed that someone had been down there as recently as the night before the police arrived, meaning whoever had built this underwater observatory had been visiting it regularly, watching the Brennan family throughout their entire stay. The investigation revealed that the cameras had been accessed remotely, the footage uploaded to an encrypted server that police are still trying to trace. David Keller, the man arrested back in 2003, had died in 2011, which means someone else had taken up his obsession, someone who'd perfected his technique and was still out there. The case remains open, and the Brennan family refuses to go near any lake anymore, haunted by the knowledge that for an entire week, something in the darkness below had been watching their every move. Story 2. The rental agreement. In July of 2021, Ethan Chen and his girlfriend Sophia Martinez were desperately searching for the perfect vacation rental to celebrate their 3-year anniversary. They'd been scrolling through vacation rental sites for weeks, looking for something special on Lake Tahoe, when Sophia found what seemed like an absolute dream property. The listing showed a stunning modern lake house with floor-to-ceiling windows, a private dock, and panoramic views of the crystal blue water. The interior photos displayed sleek, minimalist furniture, a gourmet kitchen with top-of-the-line appliances, and a master bedroom with a balcony overlooking the lake. The price was surprisingly reasonable for Lake Tahoe, almost 30% cheaper than comparable properties, and it had perfect 5-star reviews from previous guests. The owner, a man named Dale Westbrook, responded to their inquiry within minutes, eager to have them stay. Ethan thought it was too good to be true, but Sophia was already imagining morning coffee on that balcony, so they booked it for a full week. When they arrived at the property, it was even more beautiful in person. Dale met them at the door, a friendly man in his late 50s, with an overly enthusiastic smile that felt slightly forced. He spent nearly 45 minutes walking them through the house, which seemed excessive for a rental property. But Ethan and Sophia attributed it to him being a meticulous host. However, as Dale gave them the tour, they started noticing oddities. 3 doors on the second floor were equipped with heavy-duty deadbolts locked from the outside, which Dale quickly explained were just storage closets for his personal belongings. The basement door had not 1 but 3 separate locks, and Dale made a point of emphasizing that the basement was completely off-limits, stated clearly in the rental agreement they'd signed. There was also a peculiar clause they'd skimmed over during booking that prohibited guests from being anywhere on the property between 2 and 5 a.m., described as quiet hours for wildlife observation. Dale explained that the area had sensitive nocturnal wildlife, and any noise or light during those hours could disturb protected species, which would result in hefty fines. It sounded odd, but they were too excited about the vacation to question it further. The first 2 days were absolutely perfect. They spent their time swimming, kayaking, and exploring the area. But on the 3rd night, something happened that shattered the illusion. Sophia woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and noticed something strange through the bedroom window. There were lights on in what was supposed to be one of the locked storage rooms on the opposite side of the house. She could see shadows moving across the ceiling, distinctly human shadows, and she could hear faint sounds, muffled voices, or maybe music. She couldn't quite tell. She woke Ethan, and they both sat in the darkness, watching the light for nearly 20 minutes before it finally went dark again. They checked the smart home control panel Dale had shown them, but it indicated no one else was in the house. All entry sensors showed secure. Ethan convinced Sophia it must have been Dale stopping by to retrieve something from storage. Though it was bizarre, he'd do so at 3 in the morning without notifying them. The next day, Ethan received a text message from Dale that made his skin crawl. It read, "I noticed some movement on the cameras last night around 3 a.m. Just a friendly reminder that the rental agreement specifies no activity during wildlife observation hours. Please respect the property rules." The message itself wasn't threatening, but the implication was clear. Dale was watching them, monitoring their movements inside the house through cameras they hadn't been told about. Ethan immediately started searching the rooms and found 6 cameras hidden throughout the property, in smoke detectors, in the corners of mirrors, even one disguised as a phone charger in the bedroom. When he confronted Dale via text, the man responded calmly, stating that all cameras were disclosed in the rental agreement's fine print, Section 12, subsection D, which was technically true, buried in paragraph after paragraph of legal language they'd never fully read. That night, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the house. While Ethan was in the shower, she decided to test one of the locked storage room doors. Using a credit card, she managed to slip the simple lock on one of them. The deadbolts weren't actually engaged. What she found inside made her stomach drop. The room wasn't a storage closet at all. It was a bedroom, fully furnished, with a made bed, personal belongings on the dresser, and clothes hanging in the closet. On the nightstand was a wallet containing an ID for a woman named Rebecca Tompkins. Sophia quickly searched the name on her phone and found a missing person report from 2020. Rebecca Tompkins, age 29, had last been seen checking into a Lake Tahoe vacation rental and had never returned home. Her car had been found abandoned at a trailhead, and authorities had assumed she'd gotten lost during a hike. But her body was never recovered. Sophia's hands were shaking as she closed the door and went to get Ethan. Together, they checked the other locked rooms. The second one contained men's belongings, including a laptop, a phone that was dead, and a jacket with a Colorado driver's license in the pocket belonging to Marcus Webb. Another quick search revealed he'd been reported missing in early 2021 after telling friends he was spending a week at Lake Tahoe. The third locked room was the most disturbing. It contained dozens of personal items, wallets, phones, jewelry, keys, all organized in labeled plastic bins with dates written on them going back to 2018. There were at least 20 different people's belongings. In that room, all vacation renters who'd apparently stayed at this property and never left. Ethan immediately tried to call the police, but his phone had no signal, which was strange because they'd had perfect service for the past 3 days. Sophia tried hers with the same result. That's when they heard it, the sound of the front door opening downstairs. Dale's voice called up cheerfully, "Ethan? Sophia? I noticed some unusual activity on the cameras. Just wanted to stop by and make sure everything's all right." His footsteps were already climbing the stairs. They weren't supposed to discover those rooms. The cameras had alerted him the moment Sophia opened that door. Ethan and Sophia made a split-second decision. They ran to the master bedroom, locked the door, and climbed out onto the balcony. It was a 15-foot drop to the ground, but they had no choice. Ethan went first, hanging from the balcony railing before dropping and rolling on impact. Sophia followed, twisting her ankle badly when she landed, but adrenaline kept her moving. They could hear Dale inside the bedroom now, calmly trying the locked door handle. They ran through the dark woods surrounding the property, stumbling over roots and rocks, until they reached the main road nearly half a mile away. A passing car stopped for them, the driver immediately calling 911 when he saw the terror on their faces. When police arrived at the property an hour later, Dale Westbrook was gone. The house was empty, wiped clean of any evidence. The locked rooms Sophia and Ethan had discovered were completely bare, no belongings, no furniture, nothing. It was as if those rooms had never contained anything at all. The basement, which police finally broke into, revealed a workshop with a sophisticated computer equipment and what appeared to be a professional cleaning station with industrial-grade chemicals. Hidden behind a false wall, they found a small room with restraints bolted to the floor and walls covered in soundproofing foam. Dale Westbrook wasn't his real name. The property was owned by a shell corporation, and the real owner's identity was buried under multiple layers of legal entities. The investigation revealed that the vacation rental listing had been active for over 4 years, with hundreds of guests staying at the property during that time. Most had left normal reviews and had no issues. But 23 people who'd stayed at that house were currently listed as missing persons across 5 different states. Authorities believe Dale, or whoever he really was selecting specific victims, people traveling alone, or couples with no rigid schedules who wouldn't be immediately missed. He'd watch them through the cameras, study their habits, and determine whether they were suitable targets. The smart home system allowed him to remotely cut off cell service, lock doors, and monitor every movement his victims made. Ethan and Sophia were 2 of only 3 people known to have discovered the truth and escaped. The FBI is still searching for the man who called himself Dale Westbrook, but he's vanished completely, and there are concerns he simply set up another property somewhere else. Another beautiful rental with perfect 5-star reviews, waiting for his next unsuspecting guests. The listing has been taken down, but Ethan and Sophia still have nightmares about what would have happened if they'd followed the rental agreement and stayed in their room during those quiet hours. What Dale had planned to do while they slept, and how close they came to becoming 2 more names on a missing persons list. Story 3. The Winter Caretaker. Connor McBride was 34 years old when he took the winter caretaker position at the Blackstone Lake House in northern Ontario, Canada, in February of 2018. He'd been going through a difficult divorce and needed to get away from everything. And the job posting seemed perfect for someone who wanted complete isolation. The property owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Frost who lived in Toronto, needed someone to maintain her family's vacation house during the brutal Canadian winter months when the lake froze solid and snow made the property inaccessible except by snowmobile. The pay was surprisingly generous for what seemed like simple work: keeping the pipes from freezing, monitoring the structure, and ensuring no damage from the severe weather. Margaret warned him during their phone interview that the isolation was extreme. The nearest town was 40 miles away through dense forest, and once the heavy snows came, he might not see another human being for weeks at a time. Connor assured her he could handle it. He thought solitude was exactly what he needed to clear his head and figure out his life. He had no idea how wrong he was. Connor arrived at the property in mid-February during a brief break in the weather. The lake house was larger than he'd expected, a 3-story structure built in the 1970s with dark wood paneling and large windows that overlooked the frozen expanse of Blackstone Lake. The ice was over 2 feet thick, covered with snow that stretched to the tree line on the opposite shore nearly a mile away. The silence was absolute and oppressive, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring because there's literally no sound to process. Margaret had left detailed instructions, generator maintenance schedules, firewood locations, and emergency contact numbers, though she admitted cell service was non-existent and the satellite phone was temperamental at best. She'd also left 6 months' worth of supplies, canned goods, dried foods, and frozen meat packed in a large freezer in the basement. Connor wouldn't need to leave the property until spring thaw in late April. As Margaret's son drove away on the snowmobile, leaving Connor completely alone, he felt a strange mixture of relief and unease watching the small vehicle disappear into the white landscape. The first week passed uneventfully. Connor established a routine, waking at dawn to check the generator, spending afternoons reading from Margaret's extensive book collection, and nights listening to an old radio that picked up only one station from Quebec. Mostly static with occasional bursts of French-language programming. The isolation was more intense than he'd anticipated, but he was managing. Then, on his 8th night there, something happened that shattered his peace. He was lying in bed around 3 in the morning when he heard it. A rhythmic knocking sound coming from inside the walls. It wasn't the house settling or pipes, expanding from temperature changes, both of which he'd grown accustomed to. This was deliberate. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more knocks. It seemed to be moving, starting from the eastern wall of his bedroom and traveling through the house, down the hallway, across the living room, always maintaining that same pattern. Connor grabbed his flashlight and searched every room, but found nothing that could explain the sound. After about 20 minutes, it simply stopped. He convinced himself it must have been ice shifting on the lake, sound carrying strangely through the frozen landscape, though deep down he knew that explanation didn't make sense. The knocking returned the next night at exactly 3 a.m. Same pattern, same progression through the house. And the night after that, and every single night for the next 2 weeks. Connor started dreading nightfall, lying awake waiting for 3 o'clock to arrive. He tried the satellite phone to call Margaret, but could never get a clear connection, just fragments of static and distorted voices. On the 16th night of the knocking, Connor noticed something that made his blood freeze. There were tracks in the snow outside. Human footprints that hadn't been there when he'd checked the generator that morning. The tracks came from the direction of the frozen lake, approached the house, circled it completely, then returned back toward the ice. The prints were barefoot, which was impossible in negative 20-degree weather. Connor followed them with his flashlight as far as he dared. They led straight out onto the frozen lake and stopped abruptly about 200 feet from shore, as if whoever made them had simply vanished or gone through the ice. But the ice was solid. No cracks, no holes, nothing to indicate anyone had fallen through. Connor spent the next day boarding up the first-floor windows from the inside and double-checking every lock. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe the tracks were old and he'd just never noticed them. Maybe animals had disturbed the snow in a way that looked like footprints. But that night, at exactly 3 a.m., the knocking came again. Only this time it was louder, more insistent. And it wasn't coming from inside the walls anymore. It was coming from the front door. 3 heavy knocks that shook the frame, a pause, then 3 more. Connor stood frozen in his bedroom, gripping a fireplace poker, his heart hammering in his chest. The knocking continued for 10 minutes before moving to the back door, then the basement entrance, then back to the front, as if something was circling the house, trying every entrance. When dawn finally came, Connor rushed outside to check for tracks. The entire perimeter of the house was surrounded by those same barefoot prints, dozens of them, overlapping and circling. But again, they led back to the lake and vanished in the same spot. Desperate for answers, Connor searched through Margaret's belongings and found a box of old newspapers in the attic. What he discovered made everything infinitely worse. In January of 1987, a young woman named Sarah Cartwright had gone missing from this exact property. She'd been staying at the lake house with her boyfriend for a winter weekend when he woke up one morning to find her gone. Her coat and boots were still by the door, and tracks in the snow showed she'd walked out onto the frozen lake in bare feet during the night. Search parties found a hole in the ice about 200 feet from shore, approximately where Connor's mysterious footprints always ended. Her body was never recovered. The lake in that area was over 300 feet deep, too dangerous to search in winter. The boyfriend told police that Sarah had been acting strangely the days before she disappeared, claiming she heard someone calling her name at night, insisting someone was knocking on the walls, trying to get her attention. He thought she was suffering from cabin fever, the psychological breakdown that can occur during extreme isolation. The case was ruled a probable suicide, though some investigators suspected the boyfriend might have been involved. He was never charged, and the case went cold. Connor's hands were shaking as he read the article. That night, he made the decision to leave at first light. Caretaker job be damned. But at 3 a.m., the knocking came again, and this time there was something else. A voice, faint and feminine, coming from just outside his bedroom window. It was calling his name, drawn out and pleading. "Connor, help me. I'm so cold. Please let me in." He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping his blankets, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. But the voice continued, growing more desperate. "Connor, I see you. I know you're in there. Please, I've been out here so long. Just open the door." Against every instinct screaming at him not to, Connor crept to the window and looked out. Standing on the snow-covered lawn, illuminated by moonlight, was a woman in a thin nightgown, her skin blue-white from cold, her feet bare and blackened with frostbite. She was staring directly at him with eyes that were completely black, and her mouth was moving, but the words didn't match the voice he was hearing. The voice was coming from behind him, inside the room. Connor spun around and saw nothing. But when he turned back to the window, the woman was closer. Impossibly closer. Now standing directly against the glass, her frozen fingers pressed against the pane. Her mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide, showing too many teeth. He scrambled backward, falling over his bed, and when he looked again, she was gone. But the knocking had started throughout the entire house. Dozens of points knocking simultaneously, upstairs, downstairs, in the walls, under the floors, a deafening percussion that made the house shake. It continued until dawn, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Connor lasted 3 more days before the isolation, and terror broke him completely. He loaded up the snowmobile with supplies and made the dangerous journey to the nearest town through a developing blizzard. When he finally reached civilization and told his story, people exchanged knowing glances. The locals explained that Margaret Frost went through caretakers constantly, usually every few weeks. Some left immediately, others lasted a bit longer, but none ever completed their contract. The property had a reputation. Everyone in the area knew about Sarah Cartwright and the others, because Sarah wasn't the first person to disappear from that lake. Records going back to the 1800s documented similar incidents. People wandering onto the ice barefoot in the middle of winter, compelled by something they couldn't resist. The indigenous Ojibwe who'd originally inhabited the area had legends about Blackstone Lake, about something that lived in the deepest part, something that froze during the long winters and became desperate for warmth, for life, for company. Connor never went back to retrieve his belongings. Margaret eventually hired someone else, another person desperate enough to ignore the warnings. The local police do a welfare check on the property every winter, and they always find the same things. Barefoot tracks in the snow leading from the house to the lake, knocking reported by anyone who stays overnight, and every few years, another missing person whose last known location was the Blackstone Lake house. Connor moved as far south as he could, to Florida where it never freezes. But he still wakes up sometimes at exactly 3 a.m., hearing that knocking in the walls and that voice calling his name, begging to be let in from the cold. Story 4. The Children's Game. Vanessa Hartley was 31 years old when she inherited her grandmother Ruth's lake house on the shores of Lake Sinclair in central Georgia in the summer of 2017. She'd never actually visited the property as a child, which she'd always found strange considering how close her family had been. Her mother had always made excuses about why they couldn't go there, claiming the house was too run down or that Grandma Ruth preferred her privacy. When Ruth passed away at 87, Vanessa was shocked to discover she'd left the lakefront property entirely to her, bypassing Vanessa's mother completely. The lawyer handling the estate mentioned that Ruth had been very specific in her will, stating that the house should go to someone who'd never been there before, someone with no memories of the place. At the time, Vanessa thought it was just an elderly woman's eccentricity, but she'd soon learn that Ruth had her reasons. Vanessa drove down from Atlanta in late June, excited to see her inheritance. The house was located at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by towering pine trees draped with Spanish moss that created an almost tunnel-like approach. The property itself was larger than she'd expected, a sprawling single-story structure built in the 1950s with a screened-in porch that faced the lake. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown. But underneath the neglect, she could see the bones of something beautiful. What struck her immediately upon entering was how many children's toys were scattered throughout the house. There were dolls on shelves, wooden blocks in corners, a rocking horse in the living room, and a toy sailboat on the mantel. Everything was covered in decades of dust, frozen in time like a museum exhibit. Vanessa knew her grandmother had raised 3 children in this house, including her own mother. But something about the sheer quantity of toys felt excessive, almost obsessive. That evening, as Vanessa was sorting through boxes in what appeared to be a storage room, she found a photograph that made her pause. It showed 5 children standing on the dock, ranging in age from about 6 to 12 years old, all wearing old-fashioned swimming clothes from what looked like the 1970s. She recognized her mother as the oldest child, but she'd only ever known about 2 siblings, which meant there should have been only 3 children in the photo. When Vanessa called her mother to ask about it, there was a long, uncomfortable silence on the line. Finally, her mother said in a tight voice, "Vanessa, I need you to leave that house right now. Don't ask questions, just pack your things and go. I'll explain everything later, but please do not stay there after dark." When Vanessa pressed for answers, her mother hung up. She tried calling back multiple times, but her mother wouldn't answer. Vanessa decided to ignore the warning. She was a rational adult who didn't believe in superstitions, and she wasn't about to abandon her inheritance because of her mother's unexplained paranoia. Besides, it was already getting dark, and the nearest hotel was over an hour away. She'd stay one night, get some rest, and deal with her mother's dramatics in the morning. She made herself dinner using supplies she'd brought from Atlanta, and as night fell, she sat on the porch listening to the sounds of the lake. Cicadas thrummed in the trees, and bullfrogs called from the shore. It was actually quite peaceful. Around 10 o'clock, she went to bed in what had been her grandmother's room, exhausted from the long day. She woke sometime after midnight to the sound of children laughing. It was coming from outside, near the water. Vanessa's first thought was that neighborhood kids were swimming at night, trespassing on her property. She got up and looked out the window toward the lake. In the moonlight, she could see small figures moving on the dock. 4 or 5 children running and playing. Their laughter echoed across the water, but there was something wrong with the sound. It had a hollow quality, like it was coming from far away or from inside a tunnel. Vanessa grabbed her flashlight and went outside to tell them to leave. But the moment she stepped onto the porch, the laughter stopped. The dock was empty. She walked down to the water, shining her light across the weathered wood, and found small wet footprints leading from the lake up to the house. Child-sized prints that glistened in her flashlight beam. They went right up to the back door, which she distinctly remembered locking. When Vanessa went back inside, her heart nearly stopped. The toys that had been arranged on shelves and in corners were now scattered across the living room floor, arranged in a pattern that looked like children had been playing with them. The wooden blocks spelled out words, "Come play with us." The dolls were positioned in a circle around the rocking horse, which was moving slowly back and forth despite no one touching it. Water dripped from the toys, forming puddles on the hardwood floor. Vanessa's rational mind struggled to find an explanation. Maybe there had been a leak in the roof. Maybe she'd disturbed the toys earlier and hadn't noticed. But she couldn't explain the blocks spelling words or the rocking horse moving on its own. She decided to leave immediately, but when she tried to start her car, the engine wouldn't turn over. Her phone had no signal, which she'd noticed earlier, but hadn't thought much about. She was trapped until morning when she could walk to find help. Going back inside felt impossible, but sleeping in a dead car felt equally terrifying. She chose the car, locking all the doors and huddling in the back seat with her flashlight. Around 3 in the morning, she heard tapping on the window. When she looked up, there were handprints covering the glass. Small handprints, dozens of them, appearing one after another, as if invisible. Children were pressing their hands against the car from all sides. The tapping grew more insistent, becoming pounding, and the car began to rock gently. Vanessa covered her ears and squeezed her eyes shut, praying for dawn. When the sun finally rose, the handprints were gone. Her car started on the first try, as if nothing had been wrong with it. But Vanessa didn't leave immediately. Something compelled her to search the house one more time, to find answers about what was happening. In her grandmother's bedroom, she discovered a locked chest under the bed. Using a hammer from the garage, she broke it open. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and a journal in her grandmother's handwriting. What she read explained everything and made her wish she'd listened to her mother's warning. In July of 1973, Ruth had been watching 5 children at the lake house, her own 3 kids including Vanessa's mother, and 2 neighbor children, siblings named Emma and Thomas Bradshaw, ages 7 and 9. The children had been playing a game they'd made up called Ghost Tag, where one child would pretend to drown and the others had to rescue them. Ruth had told them repeatedly to stop, that it was dangerous. But children rarely listened to such warnings. On July 14th, Emma Bradshaw actually did drown while playing the game. She'd been underwater too long, and by the time the other children realized she wasn't pretending, it was too late. Thomas, her brother, dove in to save her and never came back up. Ruth and the neighbors searched frantically, but the lake in that area was known for having underwater caves and strange currents. Both children's bodies were eventually recovered 3 days later, found together in an underwater cave system about 200 feet from the dock. The tragedy destroyed Ruth. According to her journal, she blamed herself completely, and the guilt consumed her for the rest of her life. But what made the journal truly disturbing were the entries that came later. Ruth wrote that the drownings had awakened something, or perhaps had created something. The children's spirits, or whatever they'd become, didn't understand and they were dead. They thought they were still playing the game. Every summer solstice, they would return to the lake house, looking for other children to play with, trying to continue the game that had killed them. Ruth wrote about hearing laughter at night, about toys moving on their own, about wet footprints leading from the lake. She'd kept all the toys out as a kind of appeasement, hoping that if the spirits had something to play with, they wouldn't try to lure living children into the water. Ruth had forbidden any children from visiting the property after that summer. Vanessa's mother and her siblings had been taken away immediately after the drowning and had never returned, which explained why Vanessa had never visited as a child. The journal's final entries, written just weeks before Ruth's death, were the most chilling. Ruth wrote that the spirits were getting stronger, more insistent. They'd expanded their game, no longer appearing only on the solstice, but throughout the summer months. They were lonely and desperate for playmates, and they didn't understand why no children ever came to the lake house anymore. Ruth feared what would happen when she died, when there was no one left to maintain the toys, to keep the spirits occupied. She'd left the house to Vanessa specifically because Vanessa had no children and had mentioned in family conversations that she never wanted any. Ruth believed the property needed an owner who would never bring children there, someone who could keep future families safe by keeping them away. Vanessa took photographs of every page in the journal and left the property that morning, never to return. She tried to sell the house, but when she disclosed the drowning history, potential buyers backed out. Local real estate agents eventually told her the truth. Everyone in the area knew about the lake house on Sinclair, about the Bradshaw children, and about the strange things that happened there every summer. Property values in the entire area were depressed because of its reputation. Vanessa ultimately donated the property to the county with the stipulation that it never be used for residential purposes. The house now sits abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the Georgia wilderness. But locals report that every summer, if you drive past the property at night, you can still hear children laughing near the water. And sometimes you can see small figures playing on the dock, forever trapped in a game that turned deadly over 50 years ago. The county has posted warning signs along the shore, but every few years, someone ignores them and goes swimming in that area. Drownings at Lake Sinclair occur at a rate significantly higher than similar bodies of water in Georgia, and many of those who drown are found with expressions on their faces that witnesses describe as peaceful, almost playful, as if they'd willingly gone under the water while playing a game. Vanessa lives in Colorado now, as far from lakes as she can manage. But she still has nightmares about those wet footprints leading to her grandmother's back door, and the sound of children's laughter echoing across dark water, forever calling for someone to join their game. Story 5. The Fishing Trip. In August of 2020, Derek Morrison and 4 of his closest friends rented a lake house on the remote shores of Lake Crescent in Washington State for a bachelor party weekend. The group, consisting of Derek, his brother Austin, and friends Jared, Brandon, and Kyle, had specifically chosen an isolated property miles from any town because they wanted complete privacy. The rental listing emphasized the extreme seclusion, accessible only by a narrow dirt road winding through dense forest for over 8 miles. The nearest neighbor was supposedly 5 miles away by boat, and cell service was non-existent. For guys in their early 30s looking to relive college days, it seemed perfect. They arrived Friday afternoon with trucks loaded with beer, fishing gear, and enough food for a week. The lake house was a rustic 2-story log cabin with a large deck overlooking crystal-clear water. Lake Crescent is known for its extraordinary depth, over 600 feet in some areas, and water so pure you can see down 50 feet. The first evening went exactly as planned, grilling steaks, drinking heavily, and staying up late around a fire pit on the beach. Around midnight, they noticed a boat idling offshore about 200 yards out. No lights, just sitting there in darkness. Brandon grabbed binoculars but couldn't make out details. After 20 minutes, the engine roared to life and it sped away. They dismissed it as another fisherman. Saturday morning, they took their rented boat out fishing. After 2 hours, they encountered 3 rough-looking men in a beat-up aluminum boat. One bearded man with a scar down his cheek asked if they'd caught anything. The conversation started friendly, but turned sinister when he asked where they were staying. Derek gave a vague answer, but the scarred man smiled coldly and said, "Yeah, we know the place. The big cabin at the end of Miller's Road." Derek never mentioned which road, and the cabin wasn't visible from there. The man added, "You should be careful. This lake has a reputation. People disappear sometimes, especially outsiders who don't respect local customs." When Austin asked what he meant, the men laughed and motored away. But the scarred man called back, "See you boys tonight." The group returned deeply unsettled, debating leaving early. Brandon drove to town for ice, and when he mentioned their location to a gas station clerk, her face went pale. She warned they needed to leave immediately, that the area was controlled by locals running illegal operations who didn't tolerate outsiders. She explained that kayakers had gone missing from that area years ago, officially ruled drownings. But everyone knew the truth. The family used isolation to their advantage, and rental properties were essentially bait. Brandon rushed back to warn the others. By sunset, their nightmare began. While Brandon was gone, someone had visited the property. 3 vehicles had slashed tires, and "leave" was spray painted across the deck in wet red paint. Only Kyle's truck remained functional, but the exit road was blocked by a deliberately felled tree too large to move. They were trapped. They called 911, but dispatch said the nearest deputy was over an hour away. The group barricaded doors, turned off lights, and armed themselves with knives, bats, and a flare gun. Austin, an Afghanistan veteran, positioned people at windows. Around 10 o'clock, multiple trucks and ATVs surrounded the property, headlights creating a perimeter of light. 8 or 9 men appeared, some carrying rifles. The scarred man called out cheerfully, "Come on out, boys. We just want to talk about rental fees. This is our lake, and anyone who uses it owes us a toll. $20,000. What followed was 6 hours of psychological warfare. The men threw rocks through windows, fired shots into the air, and cut the power. Derek called 911 again, learning deputies were dealing with multiple simultaneous incidents, later revealed to be coordinated distractions. When a Molotov cocktail crashed through an upstairs window, setting the second floor ablaze, they had no choice but to run for the boat. Derek and Austin created a diversion while others sprinted toward water. Kyle was tackled but broke free. In a brutal fight, all 5 reached the boat. Jared dove underwater to cut the anchor while bullets pinged off the hull. Brandon started the engine, and they roared away as the cabin burned behind them, flames climbing into the night sky. They navigated by moonlight to the opposite shore, where an elderly couple sheltered them and called police. When deputies arrived hours later, the cabin was reduced to foundation and attackers were gone. The scarred man was identified as Ray Cullen, suspected in multiple disappearances, but never charged. Investigation revealed Ray and his family had been running protection rackets and worse in that isolated area for over a decade. Multiple families came forward reporting similar harassment they'd been too afraid to report. Derek, Austin, Jared, Brandon, and Kyle survived physically, but carry permanent scars. Kyle has hearing damage. Brandon developed severe PTSD requiring years of therapy, and Derek postponed his wedding by 6 months. The rental company was partially complicit, knowing about problems but prioritizing profit. Ray Cullen was eventually arrested with 6 family members, though legal proceedings continue. The 5 friends never took another trip together, the trauma fracturing their bond irreparably. None will go near isolated lake properties anymore, carrying the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous predators are utterly human, and they're still out there waiting for the next unsuspecting victims. Story 6. The Previous Owner. In October of 2019, Lauren and Greg Mitchell purchased a foreclosed lake house on Lake Champlain in Vermont for 40% below market value. The real estate agent, Patricia Chen, seemed desperate to close quickly, explaining it was a bank foreclosure that came fully furnished with all the previous owner's belongings. The bank wanted everything gone as is. Greg saw it as an incredible investment, but Lauren felt uneasy about living among a stranger's possessions. Still, after 2 years of searching, they signed the papers within a week. The previous owner was Howard Finch, a retired professor who'd lived alone for 15 years before foreclosure. When they arrived, they were struck by how much he'd left behind. Every room contained furniture, books, kitchen supplies, clothing in closets, and personal photographs on walls. It felt less like someone moved out and more like they'd vanished mid-life. The house had a strange metallic smell that wouldn't dissipate. Greg wanted to throw everything away, but Lauren insisted they go through Howard's belongings carefully to return personal items. As they sorted through the house, Lauren noticed disturbing patterns. Bookshelves held hundreds of true crime books, almost exclusively about missing persons and unsolved disappearances. Desk drawers were filled with newspaper clippings about people who'd vanished near bodies of water, cases spanning decades. There were maps of Lake Champlain with areas circled in red ink and handwritten notes reading, "Depth here sufficient," "Current patterns favorable," and "Visibility poor in evening." Lauren showed Greg, who dismissed it as an eccentric professor's research project. But the notes read less like academic work and more like planning documents. In the attic, Lauren discovered a locked steamer trunk behind Christmas decorations. Despite Greg's protests, they broke the lock. Inside were dozens of personal items that clearly didn't belong to Howard. Women's jewelry, men's watches, wallets with IDs and credit cards, car keys, cell phones, and clothing carefully folded and preserved. Each item was sealed in a plastic bag with dates written in black marker ranging from 2004 to 2019, the entire time Howard lived there. Greg immediately called police. Detective Sarah Voss examined the trunk and recognized several names as missing persons from cold cases. One wallet belonged to Jennifer Kwan, who disappeared kayaking in 2011. Another ID belonged to Marcus DeLeon, a hiker who'd vanished in 2015. 18 different people's belongings were in that trunk, all matching profiles of those who disappeared near Lake Champlain during Howard's residency. Investigation revealed Howard hadn't fallen behind on payments. He disappeared 3 months before foreclosure, and the bank initiated proceedings only after he failed to respond to contact. Police found a false wall in the basement concealing a workshop with rope, weights, tarps, and cleaning supplies. There was also a detailed journal documenting what police believe were 15 years of murders. Howard's system involved identifying lone visitors, gaining their trust as a friendly professor, luring them to his property, drugging them, and disposing of bodies in Lake Champlain's 400-foot depths using sophisticated weighting methods. He kept one trophy from each victim. Howard's final journal entries revealed paranoia. He believed victims were haunting the house, seeing faces in water at night, hearing knocking in walls, and finding unexplained wet footprints. Entries became disjointed. describing how victims wanted him to join them in the lake, calling to him at night. His final entry, dated June 28th, read, "They're right. It's time to go down. I can hear them all singing from the deep. I'm coming." Howard's body was never recovered, but search teams found his empty boat 3 days after his last entry, shoes neatly placed inside with weights missing from his garage. Police believe he may have taken his own life, though some investigators noted the staged appearance of the scene and questioned whether he faked his death. The case remains open with Howard listed as missing. Lauren and Greg moved out immediately and have fought legal battles to void the sale. The bank claims no knowledge of Howard's crimes. The house sits empty, technically owned by the Mitchells, but considered unsellable. Everyone locally knows what happened there. Lauren has nightmares about the trunk and 18 victims, wondering how many more existed. She thinks constantly about those items: someone's daughter's necklace, someone's husband's watch, lives reduced to trophies in a killer's collection. Identified victims' families got closure, but Lauren and Greg have none. 4 days in that house destroyed their lakefront dream and left them with knowledge they'd lived where a serial killer planned murders for 15 years and was possibly driven mad by guilt or something that called from the water's darkness below. Story 7. What lives in Lake Hartwell? 7/730. Lake Hartwell sits on the South Carolina and Georgia border, a massive reservoir created in 1962 covering 60,000 acres with depths over 180 feet. It attracts millions annually for boating and fishing. But multiple unconnected witnesses have reported something in Lake Hartwell that defies explanation, turning a vacation spot into a subject of genuine fear. This isn't one isolated incident, but a pattern spanning years, all describing the same impossible thing: living in deep water. In March 2015, commercial fisherman Robert Hayes was night fishing near the dam when his sonar showed something massive moving beneath his boat, at least 30 feet long, circling deliberately 80 feet down. His boat lurched violently from below. Then all electronics died simultaneously. In moonlight, Robert saw water churning as a dark mass rose from below. Something enormous, with an undulating serpentine motion. When it passed under his boat, he saw bioluminescent patterns glowing pale blue along its body. His boat rocked again, and Robert cut anchor, using his trolling motor to reach shore. The creature descended rapidly as he approached shallow water, and his electronics came back online at 40 feet depth. Lake authorities attributed it to a large catfish, though the lake's record was only 58 pounds. In July 2017, the Patterson family from Ohio was swimming near Clemson Marina when 9-year-old Emma screamed and went under. Her father James dove and found Emma being pulled downward by invisible force. He grabbed her and felt resistance, but looking through clear water, saw nothing. No vegetation or rope. He pulled harder, and Emma came free. But as they surfaced, James saw water below them darken with a massive presence blocking light from the surface. It passed underneath toward deeper water, over 20 feet long by his estimate. On shore, Emma had circular impressions on her ankle like suction marks, each about 3 inches in diameter, visible for over a week. Rangers suggested fishing line, but that didn't explain the marks or what James witnessed. The most disturbing account comes from September 2019, when scuba diver Michael Torres explored near the dam wall with a partner, documenting underwater topography at 120 feet. They discovered a cave opening in submerged rock, 15 feet wide and perfectly circular, too uniform to be natural. Michael entered with his camera, while his partner stayed at the entrance. The tunnel descended 40 feet more, opening into a larger chamber. His footage captured something moving in darkness beyond his light. reflecting back with what appeared to be dozens of eyes. The video shows Michael backing up rapidly, then violent motion as something large moves toward him. Footage goes dark, then returns, showing Michael swimming frantically toward exit, with something pursuing him from the chamber. Marine biologists at 3 universities analyze the footage. Consensus being whatever appears is biological, but matches no known aquatic species. Michael refuses to dive Lake Hartwell again, stating something lives in deep caves connected to the lake, surviving there since before the dam was built. These accounts, separated by years, involve people who never met, yet describe remarkably similar experiences. Massive aquatic creature, electronic interference, intelligent territorial behavior, consistent location in deepest parts near the dam. Local fishing guides quietly admit off-record they avoid certain deep areas, particularly at night. Dozens of other reports describe boats bumped from below, sonar readings of impossibly large objects, swimmers feeling watched in deep water. The Army Corps of Engineers maintains Lake Hartwell contains nothing unusual, just typical species, but won't confirm or deny the cave system's existence. The Cherokee who inhabited this area for thousands of years have legends about Uktina, a great horned serpent living in deep pools and underground waterways, a creature both physical and supernatural guarding sacred places. When Hartwell Dam was built, it flooded 76,000 acres of river valley, submerging countless Cherokee sites and natural cave systems. Some researchers suggest if something inhabited those underground waterways, the dam's creation trapped it in the lake, cutting off migration routes. Whether Lake Hartwell contains an unknown species, a remnant population of something thought extinct, or something else remains unproven. But encounters continue. In June this year, a water skier reported being followed by a large shadow that paced her boat for over a mile before diving deep. Lake Hartwell remains open for recreation, with millions enjoying it yearly. But those who've encountered what lives in deep sections carry impossible knowledge. That beneath peaceful surface water, in caves and depths few explore, something ancient and massive continues to exist, watching from below, waiting in darkness where light cannot reach.